Welcome, fellow history enthusiasts, to another grim journey into the past. Tonight, we're delving into one of history's most visually striking yet profoundly misunderstood medical practitioners, the plague doctor. That iconic beak mask, the wide-brimmed hat, the long robe. The image conjures a certain macabre fascination in our modern minds. Some of you may even have dressed as one for Halloween, embracing the aesthetic without considering the horrifying reality behind it. So, dim your lights, get comfortable, and prepare to discover why being a plague doctor in medieval Europe was a profession that would break you physically, mentally, and spiritually, if it didn't kill you outright. Before we begin, if you're enjoying these historical deep dives, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell. And let me know in the comments what historical profession you'd like me to dissect next. Now, let's step back in time to Europe's darkest hour. Imagine opening your eyes in a small, Spartan room above an apothecary shop in 14th century Venice. The year is 1348, and you're approximately 1 month into the greatest pandemic humanity has ever known, what will later be called the Black Death. You're not some seasoned physician with decades of medical knowledge. In fact, just 3 months ago, you were a moderately successful barber surgeon specializing in bloodletting, tooth extraction, and treating minor wounds. Your new profession found you rather than the reverse. With qualified physicians fleeing the city or already dead, the Venetian authorities drafted anyone with even rudimentary medical knowledge into service. Your choices were stark: serve as a plague doctor or face fines, imprisonment, or exile. With a family to feed and nowhere to flee, you reluctantly accepted the appointment. The surface of your wooden sleeping pallet is damp with sweat despite the morning chill. You've barely slept, haunted by the faces of yesterday's patients, nearly all of whom are likely dead by now. Your body aches from the previous days trudging through narrow alleyways and up countless stairs to attend the afflicted. But most noticeable is the pervasive smell that even sleep couldn't dispel, a mixture of vinegar, herbs, and the unmistakable sweet putrid odor of disease that seems permanently embedded in your nostrils. As consciousness fully takes hold, anxiety follows immediately. How many of the houses you visited yesterday now display a cross on their door, signaling death within? How many new cases will the city officials assign to you today? And the question that plagues you every morning: is this the day you contract the disease yourself? Your room contains little in the way of comfort: a bed, a small table holding a basin of water, which you eye suspiciously as still water is thought to harbor miasma, a chest containing your few possessions, and hanging on the wall, the unmistakable silhouette of your plague costume, your only barrier between life and death. Unlike the modern image of plague doctors as mysterious figures in elaborate leather outfits, your protective gear is a hastily assembled collection based on recent theories about disease prevention, cobbled together from available materials. You rise reluctantly, performing your morning ablutions with water you boiled the night before and left to cool. Even this simple act is tinged with fear. Current medical theory holds that bathing opens the pores, potentially allowing deadly miasma to enter the body more easily. But you've observed that some form of cleanliness seems to correlate with survival among your colleagues, so you maintain this private ritual despite contradicting established medical wisdom. Breakfast is simple but carefully chosen. You eat bread soaked in wine, the wine believed to protect against infection, and some dried figs, a luxury you permit yourself as strengthening food. You've noticed that plague doctors who maintain their strength seem to last longer, though whether that's due to better health or simply the fact that stronger individuals were selected for the role is a question without answer. As you chew, you mentally prepare for the process of donning your protective costume, a daily ritual that marks your transformation from ordinary man to plague doctor, from potential victim to supposed healer. It's a transformation that carries no joy, only grim determination, and, if you're honest with yourself, a deep-seated terror that each day might be your last. Now comes the most crucial part of your morning. donning the infamous Plague Doctor costume that will be your only protection against the invisible killer stalking the streets. This is not the sleek, theatrically sinister outfit depicted in popular imagination. Your protective gear is a practical, if primitive, attempt at creating a barrier between yourself and disease, based on the latest medical theories, which unfortunately are almost entirely incorrect. You begin with your underclothes, a simple linen shirt and drawers, freshly washed and boiled whenever possible. Over this goes a waxed leather overcoat that reaches to your knees, believed to provide a sealed surface that miasma cannot penetrate. The leather is stiff and heavy, immediately restricting your movements and guaranteeing that you'll be sweating profusely within the hour, regardless of the outside temperature. Next come leather gloves, thick and unwieldy, extending up your forearms and secured tightly with cords to prevent any gap between glove and sleeve. Already your sense of touch is dramatically reduced. You'll be relying primarily on visual examination today, as detailed palpation of patients is virtually impossible through these protective layers. Leather leggings and boots complete your body covering, again carefully sealed at the junctions. Movement is now significantly restricted, your stride reduced to an awkward waddle that will grow more pronounced as the day's physical demands wear on you. But physical discomfort is a small price for what you hope is protection. The most iconic element comes last, the mask and hat. Your mask is not the refined, artistically crafted leather creation seen in modern reproductions. It's a more primitive construction, a hood of waxed canvas with a crude beak-like protrusion extending 6 inches from your face. The eye holes are fitted with glass lenses, similar to early spectacles, which limit your peripheral vision severely and will fog repeatedly throughout the day with your breath and sweat. The beak itself is packed with protective substances, dried flowers, herbs, spices, camphor, and vinegar-soaked sponges. This aromatic mixture is your primary defense against miasma, the poisonous air believed to carry the plague. The theory holds that these strong-smelling substances will either block the miasma or correct and purify the poisonous air before you breathe it. The pungent mixture burns your nostrils even through the mask, but that discomfort is reassuring. It means the aromatic barrier remains strong. Completing the ensemble is a wide-brimmed leather hat, which serves the dual purpose of identifying you as a physician and supposedly providing additional protection from miasma falling from above. With the hat secured, your transformation is complete. Looking at your reflection in a small polished metal mirror, you barely recognize yourself. The outfit transforms you into something inhuman, not the ominous, raven-like figure of later artistic depictions, but a clumsy, awkward creation that resembles a desperate attempt to seal a human being away from the environment. The costume is heavy, restrictive, and already uncomfortably warm despite the cool morning air. Your vision is limited, your hearing muffled, your sense of touch all but eliminated. Breathing through the herb-packed beak requires conscious effort, and each inhalation brings a burst of medicinal vapors that will leave your throat raw by day's end. Communication with patients will be difficult through the mask, adding to their fear when you arrive. But most troubling is the psychological weight the costume carries. It marks you unmistakably as a plague doctor, a figure simultaneously respected, feared, and often viewed with suspicion or outright hostility. To the desperate and dying, you represent either salvation or its absence. To the healthy, you are a walking reminder of the death surrounding them, potentially even bringing contagion from house to house despite your precautions. You gather your medical bag, filled with the limited tools at your disposal: herbs for poultices, vinegar for cleansing, provisions for bloodletting, and various tinctures and powders of dubious efficacy. With a deep breath of preparation, you step out to face another day of confronting an unstoppable disease with entirely inadequate means. The morning sun barely penetrates the narrow streets as you make your way toward toward your first assigned house. Venice, in the grip of plague, is a city transformed. The usually bustling commercial center of the Mediterranean world is now characterized by shuttered businesses, empty squares, and an eerie silence broken only by the occasional toll of church bells, the rumble of collection carts for the dead, and the whispered prayers of those still healthy enough to fear. You walk with the distinctive woodblock clacking staff that plague doctors carry, partly to maintain balance in your restrictive costume, but primarily to announce your presence and allow the healthy to clear from your path. The sound creates a bubble of emptiness around you as people press themselves against walls or retreat into doorways to avoid proximity. Their eyes follow you with a mixture of reverence, hope, terror, and often undisguised hostility. "Death Doctor," you hear a woman mutter as you pass, making the sign of the cross. You're used to this epithet. In the current circumstances, it's more accurate than not. Despite your title and position, you've saved precious few patients. The plague seems to mock medical intervention, claiming most victims regardless of treatment. Those who do recover appear to do so by some internal strength or divine intervention, rather than any action on your part. Your first house is marked with a white cloth, the signal that illness resides within, but death has not yet visited. Soon enough, these white markers will be replaced with crosses when the inhabitants succumb. You've witnessed this progression hundreds of times already, to the point where you now find yourself mentally calculating how many days before a white cloth becomes a cross. Before entering, you perform what has become a ritual of self-protection. From a small flask, you take a mouthful of strong vinegar and swish it around before swallowing, a burning discomfort you've grown accustomed to. You dab more vinegar on your wrists and temples, where the pulse is believed to be most vulnerable to miasma. These precautions probably do nothing, but they provide a psychological armor as important as your physical costume. The building is a modest 3-story structure housing multiple families. Your patient is on the second floor, and as you climb the narrow stairs, the smell hits you even through your herb-filled mask, the distinctive sweet putrid odor that announces the plague's presence as surely as any visual symptom. Your heart sinks. When the smell is this pronounced, death is rarely far behind. The family has followed instructions to prepare for your visit. Windows are open despite the morning chill, as fresh air is believed to disperse miasmatic vapors. Vinegar has been sprinkled around the room's perimeter, and a small brazier burns aromatic woods in the corner, adding to the choking mixture of smells. On a pallet in the center of the main room lies your patient, a girl of perhaps 12 years, her face already displaying the characteristic darkening around the eyes that gives the Black Death part of its name. The mother hovers nearby, her face etched with the desperate hope you've seen countless times, the irrational but entirely human belief that your presence might somehow reverse what is almost certainly irreversible. The father stands by the window, his expression showing the beginning stages of grief's transition to anger. You recognize his type. In another day or two, as his daughter worsens despite your treatments, his desperation will likely transform into rage directed at your ineffectiveness. "Doctor," the mother says, the word somewhere between a greeting and a plea. She worsened in the night. The swellings have grown. You nod, your mask bobbing awkwardly, and approach the girl. Communication through your costume is difficult, so you've learned to minimize it, relying on gestures and brief practical questions. You'll be described later as cold, uncaring, the emotional detachment of plague doctors becoming legendary. But the truth is more practical than sinister. Your mask muffles and distorts your voice, and conservation of energy becomes essential when you might need to visit 20 or more homes before the day ends. The examination confirms what you already knew from the smell and the mother's description. The girl displays all 3 of the plague's primary forms simultaneously: bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic. Black buboes the size of eggs distend her neck and groin. Her breathing carries the distinctive rattle of fluid-filled lungs, and dark patches mottle her extremities where blood vessels have burst beneath the skin. It's the worst possible combination, and you know with grim certainty that she will not see another sunset. Still, you go through the motions of treatment, the expected procedures that justify your presence and fee. You use a silver knife to lance one of the buboes, releasing a flow of foul-smelling, blackish pus that you catch in a ceramic bowl. The girl barely reacts to what should be excruciating pain, a sign of how far the disease has progressed. You apply a poultice of crushed herbs and pigeon dung, believed to draw out the poison, to the lanced bubo and the others that are still intact. Next comes bloodletting. Using a narrower blade, you open a vein in the girl's arm, allowing darkened blood to flow into another bowl. The current theory holds that removing the corrupted humors might restore balance to the body and allow recovery. The blood that emerges is alarmingly dark and thick, another sign that death approaches rapidly. Throughout these procedures, you maintain the detached efficiency that has become your trademark. It's not callousness, but survival. Emotional investment in each patient would destroy you within days, given the near-universal fatality of the disease. You've learned to see bodies as merely the vessels of illness, not as individuals with hopes, dreams, and families who love them. This psychological armor is as essential as your physical costume. After applying the treatments, you turn to the parents to deliver your instructions, knowing they are likely futile. Continue applying fresh poultices every few hours. Give the patient watered wine with specific herbs you provide from your bag. Maintain fresh air in the room, and sprinkle vinegar regularly. You recommend burning specific woods and herbs in the brazier to counteract miasma, and suggest that family members rub vinegar on their pulses and carry pomanders of protective herbs. What you don't say, but what hangs unspoken in the room, is that these measures will almost certainly fail. The mother seems to understand this on some level, though she clings to the small hope your treatments represent. The father's face has hardened further, anger beginning to overshadow grief. You've seen this progression before. As treatment fails, as their child slips away despite your interventions, that anger will seek a target. You, as the representative of medicine's inadequacy in the face of this plague, are the most convenient focus. As you pack your implements back into your bag, the father speaks, his voice tight with controlled emotion. The magistrate's son recovered under Dottore Benetti's care. Why can't you do the same for my daughter? It's a common question, reflecting the desperate search for patterns in what is essentially arbitrary suffering. The truth, that recovery seems random, that the occasional survivor says more about individual constitutions than treatment efficacy, is not what grieving parents want to hear. Each case is different. You reply through your mask, your voice sounding alien even to yourself. We apply the treatments that offer the best hope, but much depends on the patient's humoral balance and God's will. The invocation of divine intervention is part medical belief, part diplomatic deflection. If God decides who lives and dies, the physician cannot be fully blamed for failure. The father seems unpersuaded, but holds his peace for now. You know from experience that his restraint may not last as his daughter's condition inevitably deteriorates. Before leaving, you mark the door with chalk, updating your records of the illness's progress in this household. This practical measure serves multiple purposes: tracking the disease's spread, informing other officials which houses contain plague victims, and calculating your payment, which is based partly on the number of houses and patients visited. As you exit into the street, clacking your staff to clear your path, you mentally review your remaining appointments for the morning. There are 6 more houses to visit before midday, each likely containing scenes similar to what you've just witnessed. The weight of your costume, the restriction of your movements, the difficulty breathing through your herb-filled mask. All these physical discomforts are now compounded by the emotional burden of having delivered, essentially, a death sentence disguised as treatment. And you haven't even reached the worst part of your day yet. The afternoon will bring new cases, unexpected emergencies, and the task you've come to dread most, certifying deaths and instructing on proper disposal of bodies. By evening, your physical and emotional reserves will be thoroughly depleted, only to be inadequately replenished before you must rise and repeat the entire process tomorrow. This is the reality of being a plague doctor, not the mysterious, powerful figure of later artistic imagination, but an ordinary man drafted into extraordinary circumstances, armed with insufficient knowledge and ineffective tools, confronting death on a scale that defies comprehension. The costume that appears so theatrically sinister to modern eyes is, in truth, just a desperate and largely futile attempt to survive while performing an impossible task. By midday, you've visited 7 households, examined 12 patients, and confirmed 3 deaths from yesterday's cases. Your leather costume is now soaked with sweat inside. The herbs in your mask have become sodden and less effective, and your throat burns from hours of breathing vinegar-infused air. The physical toll is substantial, but it's the psychological burden that weighs heaviest as you make your way back to your quarters for a brief respite. The Venice you traverse is transformed by plague in ways that extend far beyond the obvious presence of disease and death. Social cohesion, the intricate web of relationships and obligations that make urban life possible, is rapidly disintegrating. Neighbors who once shared food and childcare now avoid each other entirely. Extended families that traditionally lived in close proximity and supported one another have fractured, with the healthy abandoning the sick despite blood ties. Even the basic commercial exchanges that sustain daily life have become fraught with fear, as every interaction represents potential contagion. As you pass the central market, usually a bustling hub of activity, you observe the new methods of commerce necessitated by the plague. Buyers no longer handle goods directly. Instead, they point to their desired purchases from a distance. Money is exchanged in vinegar-filled bowls, believed to neutralize contagion. Vendors and customers alike wear makeshift face coverings and gloves. The normal haggling and social banter that once characterized Venetian markets has been replaced by terse, functional exchanges conducted at maximum possible distance. The social fabric is unraveling in other ways, too. Class distinctions that once seemed immutable have been partially suspended in the face of universal vulnerability. Nobles who previously wouldn't acknowledge commoners now greet anyone who appears healthy with desperate camaraderie. Conversely, new divisions have emerged based on health status and exposure risk. You notice how people visibly calculate their proximity to others, mentally assessing each passerby as potential disease vector first, human being second. Religious practice, once a communal cornerstone, has become paradoxically both more intense and more isolated. As you pass a church, you observe worshippers spaced widely apart in the pews, the shared chalice of communion replaced by individual blessings from a priest who keeps his distance. Outside, makeshift shrines have appeared on street corners, allowing for more private devotion without the risk of congregating. The plague has transformed even how people approach their God, replacing communal worship with isolated supplication. Reaching your quarters, you begin the laborious process of removing your plague costume for your midday break. This is not merely undressing, but a careful procedure believed to minimize risk of contamination. You clean each piece with vinegar as you remove it, paying particular attention to your gloves and mask, which have had the most direct exposure to the sick. The rank smell of sweat that emerges as you peel off layers would be embarrassing in normal times, but now registers only as a reminder of your continuing survival. The dead don't sweat. Your simple midday meal consists of foods believed to protect against plague. Garlic bread soaked in vinegar, wine mixed with specific herbs thought to balance the humors, and preserved lemons, which are among the few citrus fruits available in northern Italy. The meal is deliberately bland but carefully chosen according to current medical theory, which holds that certain foods can make one more vulnerable to miasmatic influence. You've noticed that many of your colleagues who've succumbed to the plague were less fastidious about their protective diets, though whether this represents causation or mere coincidence is impossible to determine. As you eat, you update your records, noting which patients have died, which show signs of recovery, precious few, and which new cases have been reported since morning. These records serve multiple purposes. They help track the plague's spread through the city, justify your fees to the authorities who employed you, and contribute to the broader medical understanding of the disease, limited though that understanding may be. The administrative aspect of plague doctoring rarely appears in later portrayals, but it occupies a significant portion of your time and energy. Each case must be documented, each death certified, each treatment recorded. The Venetian authorities are attempting to understand and control the plague through data collection, an early form of public health surveillance that requires your meticulous participation despite its questionable utility in actually stopping the disease. Your brief respite is interrupted by a pounding at your door. Opening it reveals a city official, his own face covered with a vinegar-soaked cloth, maintaining careful distance as he delivers news that makes your heart sink. A new outbreak has been identified in the Eastern Quarter, and additional plague doctors are needed immediately. Your afternoon rounds, already scheduled to include 9 households, must now expand to include assessment of the new cases. As you begin the process of donning your plague costume again, its weight feels even more oppressive than it did this morning. The mask, freshly packed with new herbs and a vinegar-soaked sponge, will protect you no better than it did earlier, despite the elaborate ritual of cleaning and preparation. The leather overcoat, still damp with the morning's sweat, clings uncomfortably to your linen undergarments. The gloves, stiff from vinegar cleaning, will require time to regain even their limited flexibility. Fully dressed once more in your protective gear, you gather your medical bag, replenishing supplies of the herbs, tinctures, and bloodletting equipment that constitute your ineffective arsenal against the plague. The weight of both physical equipment and psychological burden seems to increase with each passing day, a progressive accumulation of fatigue, frustration, and fear that no midday rest can fully alleviate. As you step back into the streets, staff clacking hollowly on the cobblestones, you're acutely aware that your afternoon rounds will be even more harrowing than the mornings. New cases mean fear is at its height, with families still processing the initial shock of diagnosis. Deaths require you to implement containment protocols that often separate the living from their deceased loved ones before proper goodbyes can be said. And somewhere in one of the houses you'll visit may be the exposure that finally breaches your protective measures and delivers the plague to your own body. This is the peculiar psychological torture of plague doctoring, the constant awareness that each patient interaction, each contaminated room, each procedure performed might be the one that proves fatal to you. Unlike soldiers who face death in moments of acute danger, your risk is continuous, invisible, and unavoidable if you are to perform your duties. The cumulative stress of this awareness contributes as much to the notorious high mortality rate among plague doctors as the actual biological exposure. With these grim thoughts weighing on you, you set off toward the Eastern Quarter, where new victims await your limited help and abundant documentation. The afternoon sun beats down, turning your protective costume into an outfit of personal torture as you prepare to confront the next phase of a day that seems designed to test the utmost limits of human endurance. The Eastern Quarter of Venice presents a new level of horror. Unlike the morning's calls to isolated cases in otherwise functional neighborhoods, this area has reached the tipping point where plague dominates the landscape. Nearly every door bears either a white cloth signaling illness or a cross marking death. The few unmarked houses stand as islands of temporary fortune in a sea of suffering, their occupants watching your approach with the desperate hope that their home might somehow remain untouched. Your first stop is a building where multiple cases have been reported. Before you even enter, you can tell this will be unlike your morning visits. No one responds to your knock, though you can hear movement inside. When you finally push the door open, the scene explains the lack of response. The entire household is afflicted, with no healthy person remaining to attend the door. 5 family members lie in various stages of plague progression, from a grandmother with fully developed buboes and pneumonic symptoms to a small child just beginning to show the telltale fever and headache that precede more visible signs. Most disturbing is the father of the household, clearly dead for at least a day, his body already showing signs of decomposition in the summer heat, still occupying the bed where he expired because no one remained strong enough to move him or notify authorities. The horror of this scene goes beyond the mere presence of disease and death. It's the complete collapse of normal human responses to illness and mortality. No comfort offered to the suffering, no dignity afforded to the dead, no ritual to mark the transition from life. The plague doesn't just kill, it obliterates the social structures that make us human, reducing existence to mere biological processes of suffering and cessation. You work methodically through this grim tableau, examining each living patient, though you know your treatments offer little hope. The grandmother is clearly hours from death, the mother perhaps a day or two, while the children present the full spectrum of plague progression. You perform the expected procedures, lancing buboes, applying poultices, administering herbal tinctures believed to correct corrupted humors, while maintaining the emotional detachment that makes the work possible. For the deceased father, you can only complete the administrative requirements, noting the death in your records, marking the door appropriately, and dispatching a message to the corpse collectors who will eventually remove the body. You instruct the still conscious mother about separating the living from the dead, though you can see in her fever-bright eyes that she lacks the strength to implement this guidance. In truth, with the entire household infected, such precautions are largely symbolic. The contagion has already spread throughout this family unit. After completing your work in this household, you pause in the street to cleanse your instruments with vinegar once more. The ineffectiveness of your interventions weighs heavily, despite your professional detachment. You've performed all the expected procedures according to current medical understanding, yet you know with near certainty that every member of that household will be dead within days. The plague mocks your training, your protective measures, and your treatments with its unstoppable progression. As you continue your rounds through the eastern quarter, a pattern becomes clear. You're no longer dealing with isolated cases, but witnessing the beginning of the plague's victory over this section of the city. House after house contains similar scenes of multiple infected family members, often with dead bodies awaiting collection. The practical challenges multiply accordingly. Instructions cannot be followed when everyone is sick. Treatments cannot be properly applied without healthy caregivers, and the dead cannot be promptly removed when the infrastructure for body collection is overwhelmed. By late afternoon, the physical toll of your work becomes nearly unbearable. Your costume, designed for protection rather than comfort, has become an instrument of torture in the summer heat. The leather overcoat traps sweat against your body, creating painful chafing at every point of movement. The mask, with its herb-filled beak, makes each breath an effort, the moisture from your exhalations gradually soaking the aromatic materials and reducing their effectiveness while increasing the effort required to draw air. Your vision, limited by the glass eyepieces that have repeatedly fogged and been wiped clear throughout the day, is further compromised by fatigue and the constant straining to see in darkened sick rooms. Your hands, encased in thick gloves, have lost much of their dexterity, making medical procedures increasingly difficult as the day progresses. Even walking becomes a conscious effort, your legs leaden with fatigue inside the heavy leather leggings that complete your protective ensemble, but the physical discomfort pales in comparison to the psychological burden. Each house presents variations on the same tragedy. Each patient exhibits the same progression toward probable death, and each interaction leaves you more certain of medicine's failure in the face of this unprecedented disease. The cumulative effect is a profound sense of futility that threatens to overwhelm your professional detachment. In one particularly harrowing house, you encounter a scene that will haunt you long after. A mother, already showing advanced plague symptoms, cradling her dead infant while singing a lullaby, her mind clearly detached from reality. When you attempt to explain that the child has passed and must be removed for proper disposal, she looks through you as if you're not present, continuing her song to the tiny corpse in her arms. You recognize the psychotic break for what it is, not just a symptom of the disease's effect on the brain, but the mind's desperate attempt to reject an unbearable reality. After several failed attempts to communicate, you're forced to leave the situation unresolved, making note in your records that corpse collectors will need assistance and possibly restraints when they come for the child's body. This kind of incomplete, unsatisfying conclusion becomes increasingly common as the day wears on. Problems you cannot solve, suffering you cannot alleviate, procedural requirements you cannot fully implement due to the sheer scale of the disaster unfolding around you. By the time you reach your final scheduled house call of the day, the sun is beginning to set, casting long shadows through the unusually empty streets. This last visit is to certify a death reported earlier, a procedural requirement that ensures accurate records and proper disposal of the body. It should be a relatively straightforward task after the complexities of the day's earlier cases, but when you arrive, you find the house locked and apparently empty. Neighbors, reluctantly responding to your inquiries from safe distances inside their own homes, report that the family fled after the death, taking the body with them rather than submitting to the required separation and disposal procedures. This presents both a practical problem, a plague victim's body being transported without precautions, and an administrative one, as your records will now be incomplete. Such evasions of plague protocols have become increasingly common as the epidemic progresses. Families, desperate to maintain some semblance of normal funeral practices, or simply unable to bear the thought of their loved ones being disposed of in mass graves, sometimes hide deaths or flee with bodies. The authorities respond with increasingly severe penalties, but enforcement is spotty in a city where municipal functions are stretched to breaking point. You make the required notes about the missing body and family, knowing that city officials will likely dispatch guards to track them down, though with limited hope of success. This small act of rebellion against plague protocols, a family insisting on treating their dead with traditional dignity despite the risk, strikes you as simultaneously foolish and deeply human, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming disaster, people cling to the rituals and relationships that define their humanity. As you turn to head back to your quarters for the evening, the weight of the day's experiences settles fully upon you. In theory, you have done everything required of a plague doctor, examined patients, administered treatments, documented cases, certified deaths, and maintained your own protective measures throughout. In practice, you've accomplished almost nothing of tangible value. The plague continues its inexorable spread. Your treatments have likely saved no one, and tomorrow will bring only more of the same. This is the central tragedy of the plague doctor's existence, performing elaborate medical rituals that serve primarily to create the illusion of control in the face of an uncontrollable catastrophe. Your costume, your treatments, your careful record-keeping all suggest a methodical, scientific response to disease. Yet, the plague's continued ravages reveal these measures as largely theatrical, offering psychological comfort rather than medical efficacy. As you make your way through streets increasingly dominated by the signs of plague's victory, you wonder how long you can continue this work before either the disease claims you physically or the futility of your efforts destroys you mentally. The questions that have lurked at the edges of your consciousness throughout the day now demand attention. What purpose purpose does medicine serve when it cannot heal? What meaning can be found in work that fails to achieve its primary objective? And how does one maintain humanity while surrounded by suffering that cannot be alleviated? These philosophical dilemmas, rarely captured in the iconic imagery of plague doctors that will fascinate later centuries, represent the true burden of your profession, heavier than the physical costume, more persistent than the fear of contagion, and ultimately more destructive to those who bear this role during humanity's darkest hours. Twilight settles over Venice as you finally complete your rounds and turn toward home. The city takes on an ethereal quality at this hour, with fewer people visible on the streets, and an unnatural stillness replacing the bustle that would characterize a normal evening in the commercial heart of the Mediterranean. The only consistent activity comes from the corpse collection crews, now working with torches as they move from marked house to marked house, retrieving the day's dead for disposal outside the city limits. The sight of these crews, men in protective coverings similar to but less elaborate than your own, pulling carts piled with corpses wrapped in shrouds, has become so commonplace that it barely registers as unusual anymore. This normalization of the extraordinary is perhaps the most insidious effect of the plague on the collective psyche. What would have been unthinkable horrors months ago are now simply the background texture of daily existence. You pass one such collection crew as they struggle to maneuver a particularly heavy corpse down a narrow staircase. Their curses and dark humor float through the evening air. Another coping mechanism that outsiders might view as callous, but which represents a necessary psychological defense for those who handle the dead by the dozens each day. They nod to you with the grim camaraderie of fellow plague workers, each acknowledging the other's role in this macabre ecosystem that has developed around mass death. As you approach your quarters, you become aware of a small crowd gathered nearby, their attention focused on your door. Your first thought is practical concern. Has plague struck in your immediate vicinity, followed by a more self-interested worry that the crowd might present a threat? Plague doctors have increasingly become targets for public anger as the epidemic worsens, with some being attacked by grieving families or desperate citizens looking for scapegoats. Drawing closer, you see that this gathering is not immediately threatening, though their purpose remains unclear until one man steps forward, keeping a prudent distance but close enough to be heard through your mask. "Doctor," he begins, his voice betraying the careful control of someone managing intense emotion. "My wife was taken with plague symptoms this afternoon. The city officials say no doctor can come until tomorrow at earliest." He gestures to the small group behind him. "We all have sick in our homes who need attention now. We can pay." This last part is emphasized with the slight lifting of a small pouch that clearly contains coins. This situation, citizens seeking private treatment outside the official plague response system, represents yet another ethical dilemma in a profession already laden with them. The Venetian authorities have established protocols requiring plague doctors to prioritize cases according to official assessments, preventing privately arranged treatments that might favor the wealthy or connected. Yet the system is clearly failing to meet the need, leaving many victims without any medical attention during critical early stages when treatments might be most effective. You consider your options carefully. You're already exhausted from a full day of official rounds. Your protective gear needs thorough cleaning and replenishment, and taking on additional patients outside the system could result in disciplinary action from the authorities who employ you. Yet, the desperation in the man's eyes reflects a genuine need that the overwhelmed official response cannot address. "How many sick?" you ask, your voice muffled and distorted through the mask. "7, between our 3 families," another man answers, stepping forward. 2 children, 5 adults, all showing fever and the pain under the arms. He gestures to indicate the lymph nodes where buboes typically appear. 7 more patients would mean at least 3 more hours of work when you're already at the limits of physical endurance. The risk to yourself increases with each additional exposure, each minute spent in the miasmatic atmosphere of plague-infected homes. But the city's system will likely not reach these families for at least a day, perhaps longer, as the Eastern Quarter's outbreak stretches resources even thinner. After a moment's consideration, you nod slowly. "I will come. 1 home at a time. You must provide fresh vinegar at each house and allow me time to cleanse between examinations. Relief washes visibly over the men's faces, though you note it's the relief of action rather than genuine hope. Even these desperate citizens understand that your treatments offer slim chance of survival. What they're purchasing with their coins is not necessarily cure, but care. The comfort of having someone with presumed knowledge attend their loved ones, the sense that everything possible is being done, and, perhaps most importantly, the maintenance of normal social responses to illness in the face of a disaster that threatens to unravel such conventions entirely. "My home first," says the original speaker, offering additional payment which you wave away. The plague has made you more conscious of moral economies beyond simple coin. These families will remember who came when called and who didn't, information that could determine your acceptance in this neighborhood after the plague eventually recedes, assuming you survive to see that day. After quickly entering your quarters to replenish your medical supplies and add fresh herbs to your mask's beak, you follow the man through darkening streets to his home. The scene inside is grimly familiar. His wife lies on a pallet, already showing the characteristic buboes and the blackening of extremities that gives the Black Death its name. Their 2 children, appearing still healthy, have been moved to a neighbor's home as a precaution, a rare example of the recommended separation protocols actually being implemented. You proceed through your standard examination and treatments, explaining each step to the husband who assists with surprising steadiness. His cooperation makes the work marginally easier, allowing you to complete the process more efficiently than during many of your official visits, where panic or grief made simple procedures unnecessarily complicated. "Will she recover?" he asks as you pack your supplies to move to the next house. The directness of the question is unusual. Most family members either assume recovery is certain or recognize that death is inevitable, rarely seeking your actual assessment of chances. You consider your response carefully. The plague doctor's role includes maintaining morale, suggesting that recovery is always possible with proper treatment and God's grace. But something in this man's demeanor, a quiet dignity and emotional self-control, suggests he would prefer truth to comfortable lies. "The signs are not favorable," you say finally, your words made even more impersonal by your mask's distortion. "The blackening has progressed quickly, but I have seen recovery from similar cases. Continue the treatments as instructed. Keep her comfortable and pray." He nods, accepting this qualified death sentence with the same composure he's shown throughout. "Thank you for your honesty, doctor, and for coming when asked." This simple expression of gratitude affects you more deeply than expected. Most of your interactions with patients and families occur through a fog of their terror or grief, with little acknowledgement of your own humanity behind the mask. This man's recognition of your service, offered despite your admission of its probable futility, momentarily pierces the professional detachment you've cultivated as emotional self-defense. The moment passes quickly as practical needs reassert themselves. You move on to the next household, then the next, repeating the now automatic procedures of examination, treatment, and instruction. By the time you finish with the 7th patient, full night has fallen over Venice, and your physical reserves are completely depleted. Your costume, designed for a standard day's work, has become nearly unbearable after these additional hours. The mask, sodden with your breath, the leather garments chafing at every movement, your vision blurred with fatigue through the clouded eyepieces. When you finally return to your quarters, the simple act of removing the plague costume requires concentration you can barely muster. Each piece must be properly cleaned with vinegar, dried, and prepared for tomorrow's use. The herbs in your mask need replacement, having lost their potency through the day's constant breathing. Your instruments require careful cleaning to prevent carrying contagion between households. Even in your state of extreme fatigue, you force yourself to complete these tasks properly, knowing that any lapse in protective protocols could prove fatal. Only when these essential preparations are complete do you allow yourself to collapse onto your bed. Your body aches from the day's exertions, your skin raw in places where the heavy costume has rubbed against it for hours, your throat burning from breathing through herb-infused vinegar vapors. But it's the mental exhaustion that weighs heaviest, the accumulation of tragic scenes, the constant awareness of your treatment's ineffectiveness, and the psychological strain of maintaining professional demeanor while surrounded by suffering and death. Sleep, when it finally comes, brings little genuine rest. Your dreams are populated by the day's patients, their faces distorted by plague symptoms, merging into a grotesque parade of suffering. You dream of discovering buboes on your own body, of the slow realization that the protective measures have failed, of becoming one of the plague victims carried away on the collection carts. You dream of endless lines of supplicants seeking help you cannot provide, their accusations of failure growing increasingly hostile until they transform into a mob, tearing away your protective mask to expose you to contagion. These nightmares, a form of what modern medicine would recognize as traumatic stress response, have become a nightly occurrence for plague doctors across Europe. The psychological toll of your profession manifests in this subconscious processing of daily horrors, robbing you of the restorative sleep your body and mind desperately need. Many of your colleagues have turned to wine or stronger substances to induce dreamless sleep, though such methods bring their own complications and may reduce the vigilance needed to maintain protective measures. You wake repeatedly throughout the night, each time requiring a moment to orient yourself and confirm that the buboes you felt were dreamscape inventions rather than actual symptoms. Each time, you perform a brief self-examination, checking lymph nodes for swelling and your extremities for the blackening that signals advanced infection. This ritual of self-diagnosis, performed multiple times daily by every plague doctor, reflects the constant fear of contagion that underlies your professional existence. By the time dawn approaches, bringing with it the requirement to rise and begin the process again, you've achieved perhaps 3 hours of actual rest. It's insufficient for full recovery from the previous day's exertions, meaning that today will begin with an existing deficit of physical and mental energy. This pattern of inadequate recuperation contributes significantly to the high mortality rate among plague doctors, whose compromised physical condition makes them more vulnerable to infection despite their protective measures. As the first light filters through your window, you allow yourself one moment of honest assessment before donning the professional mask, both literal and figurative, that you'll wear throughout the day. The plague shows no sign of abating. Your treatments offer minimal effectiveness. The physical and psychological demands of your role increase daily as the epidemic worsens, and your own chances of survival diminish with each additional exposure, each compromise of protective protocols necessitated by overwhelming caseloads, each increment of fatigue that accumulates without adequate recovery. Yet you rise and begin preparing for another day, driven by a complex mixture of motivations: professional obligation, fear of punishment for dereliction, the economic necessity of maintaining your position, and perhaps most powerfully, the fundamental human need to take action in the face of catastrophe, even when that action's effectiveness is questionable. The plague doctor's existence embodies this paradox, continuing to perform largely futile medical rituals because the alternative, acknowledging medicine's complete powerlessness, is psychologically unbearable. This, perhaps more than any technical medical function, is the true role of the plague doctor in medieval society: to maintain the illusion that human knowledge and intervention can exert some control over the apparently random devastation of epidemic disease. The costume, the treatments, the elaborate protective measures all serve to suggest that the plague operates within a framework that can be understood and potentially managed, rather than representing the chaotic intrusion of unpredictable death into ordered human existence. As you once again don the iconic outfit that will define your place in historical memory, you're participating in a performance larger than individual medical care. You're enacting society's refusal to surrender completely to natural forces beyond its comprehension or control. The plague doctor, seen in this light, is less a medical practitioner than a symbolic figure, a human response to the unbearable randomness of mass death. Dawn breaks over Venice with deceptive beauty, golden light reflecting off the canals and illuminating the city's magnificent architecture. For a brief moment, observed from your window before donning your plague costume, the scene almost resembles normality, the eternal city continuing its centuries-old existence, despite the biological cataclysm currently decimating its population. This illusion of continuity provides momentary comfort before the day's grim work begins. Your morning preparations follow yesterday's pattern, though each movement requires more conscious effort due to accumulated fatigue. The protective costume feels heavier than before, the mask more suffocating, the gloves more restrictive. Your body protests these impositions with various discomforts, joints aching from yesterday's exertions, skin raw where the costume has chafed, throat still burning from hours of breathing herb-infused vinegar vapors. Before leaving your quarters, you check your official schedule for the day. The list of houses to visit has grown alarmingly, with 16 addresses now requiring your attention before midday. The increase reflects both the plague's continued spread and the declining number of available plague doctors as more succumb to the disease or flee their positions despite legal prohibitions against abandoning the city during epidemic. Your first house call sets the tone for the day ahead. Arriving at an address where 3 cases were reported yesterday, you find that 2 patients have already died overnight, while 4 additional family members now show symptoms. The official protocol requires you to examine each patient, document the progression of symptoms, or confirm death. Apply the standard treatments to the living, and mark the door appropriately to indicate the updated status. The household's emotional atmosphere has shifted from yesterday's fear and desperate hope to a numb resignation that makes your work simultaneously easier and more disturbing. Family members mechanically assist with moving patients for examination, applying poultices under your direction, and even helping to wrap the dead in shrouds for collection. Their cooperation streamlines your procedures, but their emotional detachment mirrors your own professional distance in ways that highlight the plague's psychological impacts, the way prolonged exposure to mass death erodes normal human responses. This pattern repeats throughout the morning, with variations in detail but consistency in overall trajectory. More deaths than new recoveries, more cases than available resources, more despair than hope. The mathematical reality of the Black Death becomes increasingly apparent, with mortality rates exceeding 60% and new infections outpacing recoveries. The epidemic's eventual consumption of the city seems inevitable despite all interventions. By mid-morning, a new complication emerges. At a wealthy merchant's home where you've been treating multiple family members, you're confronted by the patriarch who has clearly been awaiting your arrival with barely controlled anger. "My daughter died in the night," he announces before you've fully entered the house. After your treatments yesterday, she worsened immediately. The poultice you applied turned her skin black where it touched. This accusation that your treatments accelerated rather than alleviated the disease's progression has become increasingly common as the plague continues its seemingly unstoppable spread despite medical intervention. From a modern perspective, there's a certain validity to the claim. Many standard plague treatments, from bloodletting to certain herbal applications, likely did more harm than good to already weakened patients. But within the medical understanding of your time, these approaches represent the best available knowledge. The blackening is a symptom of the disease's progression, not the treatment, you explain through your mask, the standard response to such accusations. The humoral corruption had already spread throughout her system. The external signs merely became more visible after treatment began to draw out the poison. The merchant is unpersuaded, his grief finding focus in anger directed at the most convenient target. 3 physicians physicians attended my business partners in Florence when plague struck there, he counters. All recommended treatments different from yours. All prohibited bloodletting in cases where the lymph swellings had already formed. Are Venetian doctors less knowledgeable than Florentine ones? This comparison highlights another aspect of plague medicine rarely captured in historical accounts, the significant regional variations in treatment approaches, creating a patchwork of contradictory theories and practices across Europe. What constitutes standard care in Venice differs from protocols in Florence, Paris, or London, with each city's medical authorities convinced of their superior understanding. This lack of standardization fuels public confusion and suspicion, particularly among merchants and others who travel between affected regions and encounter these contradictions directly. Different manifestations of the disease require different approaches, you respond, falling back on the medical establishment's explanation for these variations. The Venetian College of Physicians has developed protocols based on local observations of the plague's specific characteristics in our unique environment. The reference to authority temporarily diffuses the merchant's accusation, though his expression remains skeptical. You proceed with examining the remaining family members, noting with concern that 2 previously unaffected children now show preliminary symptoms. As you prepare the standard treatments, you're acutely conscious of the merchant watching your every move with critical intensity, ready to attribute any deterioration to your interventions rather than the disease's natural progression. This adversarial dynamic, increasingly common as the plague continues despite medical efforts, represents another psychological burden for plague doctors. Beyond the physical risks and emotional toll of witnessing mass suffering, you now face growing public hostility, with your motives and competence questioned by those you're attempting to treat. The protective costume that initially inspired respect now frequently provokes suspicion or outright hostility, marking you as a representative of medicine's failure to control the epidemic. As morning progresses toward midday, your physical condition deteriorates noticeably. The costume that was merely uncomfortable at dawn has become actively painful, with every movement causing friction against raw skin. Your breathing grows labored as the mask's herb packet becomes saturated with moisture, requiring more forceful inhalation to draw adequate air. Vision blurs periodically as sweat drips into your eyes behind the glass eyepieces, which you can only partially clear by awkward maneuvers that don't require removing the mask. These physical challenges compound the intellectual and emotional demands of your role. Each patient requires careful examination, accurate diagnosis, appropriate treatment selection, and detailed documentation, all cognitive tasks made more difficult by increasing fatigue and discomfort. Maintaining professional demeanor becomes an act of conscious will rather than natural disposition, requiring constant self-monitoring to prevent displays of frustration, despair, or simple exhaustion that might further undermine patient confidence. By the time you reach your final scheduled morning house call, you're operating on reserves of determination rather than physical energy. This last visit before your midday break is to a household you've been monitoring for several days, where initial cases appeared to be responding unusually well to treatment. Such potential recovery cases receive special attention in your records, as they might offer clues to effective interventions or patient characteristics that correlate with survival. Arriving at the house, you immediately sense something is wrong. The door stands partially open, contrary to protocols requiring plague households to maintain closed doors except during necessary entries and exits. Calling out receives no response. Entering cautiously, you discover the reason for these irregularities. The entire household has fled, abandoning their home and the city despite quarantine regulations prohibiting such movement. This phenomenon of flight has become increasingly common as the epidemic progresses, despite severe penalties for those caught attempting to leave infected areas. Wealthy families in particular often maintain country estates or connections in other cities that provide escape options unavailable to the general population. This selective mobility creates yet another dimension of inequality in the plague's impact, with those of higher social standing able able to reduce their exposure risk through relocation, while the poor remain trapped in increasingly dangerous urban environments. From a public health perspective, such flight is disastrous, potentially spreading the disease to previously unaffected areas. Your official duty includes reporting this violation to city authorities, who will dispatch guards to attempt to locate and return the family. In practice, such efforts rarely succeed. The wealthy have means to avoid apprehension, and enforcement resources are already stretched beyond capacity by the epidemic's many demands. As you document the abandoned house in your records, you note with professional interest the evidence suggesting the family's hasty departure. Meals left half-eaten, valuable items still in place, clothing scattered as if packed in great haste. The timing appears deliberate, occurring just before your scheduled visit, perhaps to avoid being officially prohibited from travel due to confirmed plague cases in the household. This small act of evasion, multiplied across hundreds of similar households throughout the city, represents another way the plague undermines social cohesion and governance. When enough citizens decide that individual survival outweighs collective regulations, the entire structure of epidemic management begins to collapse. Venice's elaborate quarantine systems, among the most sophisticated in medieval Europe, ultimately depend on general compliance that becomes increasingly rare as fear overwhelms civic responsibility. Leaving the abandoned house, you make your way back toward your quarters for the midday break you desperately need. The streets seem more thinly populated than yesterday, reflecting both the epidemic's mounting death toll and the increasing tendency toward voluntary self-isolation among those still healthy. Even the few people you do encounter maintain greater distance than before, suggesting escalating fear as public awareness of the plague's uncontrolled spread grows. Reaching your quarters, you begin the laborious process of partially removing your protective gear for cleaning and refreshment. The costume's weight, which seemed merely inconvenient yesterday morning, now feels genuinely debilitating after accumulated fatigue. Each piece removed reveals physical evidence of the costume's toll. Red welts where edges have rubbed against skin, areas of inflammation where sweat has been trapped against the body for hours, circulation marks where tight seals have restricted blood flow to extremities. These physical discomforts, though significant, pale in comparison to the psychological weight that seems to increase with each passing day. This morning's rounds have reinforced what yesterday's suggested, that your medical interventions are largely ineffective against the plague's progression, that public confidence in your profession is rapidly eroding, and that the epidemic's scale now exceeds any realistic hope of containment through existing methods. The early afternoon proceeds much as the morning did, a grim procession through households in various stages of plague progression, performing treatments of dubious efficacy while documenting the epidemic's inexorable advance. But at the seventh house on your afternoon schedule, something occurs that breaches the emotional defenses you've carefully constructed around your work. The household is modest but well-maintained, home to a carpenter, his wife, and their 3 children. Upon arrival, you find only the wife showing plague symptoms, with the distinctive buboes beginning to form in her neck and groin. Her condition represents the early stage where treatments theoretically offer the greatest chance of effectiveness, though practical experience has taught you that outcomes seem determined more by individual constitution than medical intervention. What distinguishes this case initially is the family's unusual level of education and preparation. The carpenter, clearly having studied available information about the plague, has already implemented many recommended precautions, separating his wife in a well-ventilated room, maintaining vinegar-soaked cloths at entryways, having family members wear herbal sachets believed to ward off miasma. He assists your examination with intelligent questions that reflect genuine understanding rather than panic, making the process substantially more efficient. You proceed through your standard treatments, lancing the most accessible bubo to drain the corrupted humors, applying herbal poultices to the remaining swellings, preparing a tincture of specific herbs to be taken at regular intervals. Throughout these procedures, the woman remains composed despite obvious pain, following your instructions with remarkable cooperation. The children, kept at a safe distance but within eyesight per your recommendation, watch with solemn faces that reflect their father's calm demeanor rather than the terror typical of households facing plague. As you complete the treatments and begin explaining ongoing care instructions to the husband, their youngest child, a girl perhaps 4 years old, approaches despite her father's attempt to maintain the separation barrier. Before anyone can react, she reaches out and touches your leather-clad arm, looking up at your masked face with curiosity rather than fear. "Are you a Birdman?" she asks, her innocent question cutting through the professional formality that typically characterizes your patient interactions. The moment creates a sudden, unexpected breach in your emotional defenses. This child, looking at your bizarre protective costume with simple curiosity rather than terror, momentarily transforms you from the anonymous embodiment of plague response back into an individual human being interacting with another. The contrast between her innocent perception and the grim reality of your purpose strikes with surprising force, temporarily shattering the professional distance you maintain as psychological protection. The father quickly pulls her away, apologizing for the breach of protocol, but the damage to your emotional compartmentalization is already done. For the first time in weeks of plague doctoring, you find yourself truly seeing this family as specific individuals rather than generic patients. The courageous mother fighting for survival, the father maintaining strength for his children while facing potential widowhood. The children themselves balanced between innocence and premature exposure to mortality. It's a special doctor costume, you hear yourself explaining to the child, your voice gentler than usual through the mask. The beak holds medicines that help me stay healthy while I help others. This small, uncharacteristically personal interaction, acknowledging the child's curiosity rather than maintaining strict professional distance, represents a dangerous crack in the emotional armor necessary for your work. Once you begin perceiving patients as individuals with particular stories rather than manifestations of disease to be processed, the psychological weight of each case increases exponentially, potentially overwhelming your capacity to function effectively. You recognize this danger immediately and attempt to reestablish professional detachment, completing your instructions to the father in your more typical formal manner. But as you make final notes in your record book, you find yourself writing not just the standard clinical observations, but adding unusual details, that the woman is a skilled embroiderer whose work decorates their modest home, that the family maintains a small collection of books unusual for their social station, that the youngest child showed no fear of your frightening appearance. These irrelevant personal details, never previously included in your medical documentation, signal the erosion of the psychological barriers you've constructed between professional function and human empathy. As you finish the examination and prepare to leave, you find yourself genuinely hoping this particular patient recovers, a dangerous emotional investment in outcomes largely beyond your control. The encounter leaves you unsettled as you proceed to subsequent houses on your afternoon schedule. The professional detachment that previously allowed you to move efficiently through numerous cases now requires conscious effort to maintain, with each patient interaction threatening to become another crack in your psychological armor. You find yourself noticing individual details previously filtered out through focus on medical specifics. A child's toy left beside a sickbed, a wedding portrait on the wall of a room where a husband lies dying, the specific patterns of clothing worn by the deceased before illness struck. This heightened awareness of patient's humanity, while perhaps admirable from a modern perspective emphasizing empathetic care, represents a potentially fatal vulnerability for a medieval plague doctor. The emotional toll of witnessing mass suffering and death remains manageable only through psychological compartmentalization, treating each case as a medical problem rather than a human tragedy. Once this compartmentalization fails, the accumulated weight of hundreds of deaths witnessed can crush even the strongest professional resolve. By late afternoon, the consequences of this emotional breach become physically apparent. Your hands tremble slightly as you prepare treatments, requiring conscious control to maintain the precision needed for procedures like bloodletting or lancing buboes. Your breathing, already labored through the herb-filled mask, periodically catches in your throat when particularly poignant details of patients' lives register in your awareness. Even your gait, as you move between houses, becomes less assured, your body manifesting the psychological uncertainty that has infiltrated your previously mechanical approach to the work. The physical deterioration created by emotional distress compounds the existing fatigue from days of inadequate rest and extended exertion in restrictive protective gear. Where yesterday you pushed through discomfort through professional discipline, today each physical challenge triggers consideration of the human costs behind the numbers in your record book. The weight of your costume now seems to incorporate the metaphorical weight of the suffering you have witnessed, making each step a conscious effort of will rather than automatic function. At your fourth to last scheduled house, the cumulative effect of this emotional and physical deterioration reaches critical mass. The scene itself is tragically unremarkable by plague standards. A family of 6 with 4 showing advanced symptoms and 2 already dead, conditions you've documented dozens of times previously. What differs is your capacity to process this suffering with professional detachment, now fatally compromised by the afternoon's erosion of psychological barriers. As you examine a 7-year-old boy with pneumonic plague symptoms, the respiratory form that virtually guarantees death within days, his mother asks the question you have heard countless times before. Will he recover, doctor? The standard response, developed to balance truth with necessary hope, would acknowledge the severity while suggesting that proper treatment and God's grace make recovery possible. But today, with your emotional defenses breached, the practiced response fails you. You look at this individual child, really see him as a specific human being rather than a case manifestation, and find yourself unable to offer even qualified hope in the face of almost certain death. The silence stretches uncomfortably as you struggle to reconstruct your professional persona. The mother, interpreting your hesitation correctly as confirmation of her worst fears, begins to weep. Not the hysterical crying you've grown accustomed to, but a quiet, dignified acknowledgement of impending loss that somehow cuts deeper than dramatic displays of grief. "I'm sorry," you finally say, the words entirely inadequate, but all you can offer with honesty. This simple human response, entirely appropriate in normal medical practice but potentially destructive in plague doctoring, represents the complete failure of professional detachment. Once you begin genuinely empathizing with individual suffering, rather than processing cases efficiently, the scale of the catastrophe becomes psychologically unbearable. Each death transforms from a statistic to be recorded into a personal tragedy to be mourned, multiplied hundreds of times across your experience. You complete the examination mechanically, your movements now automatic while your mind struggles with this fundamental crisis of professional identity. The treatments you apply, the bloodletting, the poultices, the herbal tinctures, suddenly seem not just ineffective but actively cruel, extending suffering without realistic hope of benefit. The record-keeping that previously provided satisfaction through orderliness now appears a hollow, bureaucratic exercise in the face of overwhelming human tragedy. By the time you reach your final scheduled house, you're operating in a state modern medicine would recognize as acute psychological distress, perception narrowed, emotional regulation compromised, physical coordination impaired by stress hormones flooding your system. The protective costume that symbolized professional identity and security now feels like a prison. The mask no longer shielding you from contagion, but suffocating your connection to your own humanity. The final examination becomes a blur of mechanical motions performed without conscious direction, your body continuing the practiced procedures while your mind grapples with the fundamental questions triggered by the day's emotional breach. What purpose does medicine serve when it cannot heal? What meaning can be found in work that fails to achieve its primary objective? How does one maintain sanity while witnessing suffering on a scale that defies comprehension? As you leave this last house, marking another door with signs of plague's presence, these philosophical dilemmas crystallize into a moment of decision. The official protocol requires returning to your quarters, documenting the day's cases, cleaning your protective gear, and preparing for tomorrow's identical rounds. The momentum of professional duty pulls you toward this established pattern despite its apparent futility. But standing in the street as evening approaches, you find yourself physically unable to begin the walk back to your quarters. Your legs simply refuse the commands of professional obligation, your body manifesting the psychological revelation that has been building throughout the afternoon. The path that stretches before you, endless repetition of ineffective treatments while documenting unstoppable catastrophe, suddenly seems not just futile, but actively harmful, perpetuating illusions of control that prevent more honest responses to suffering. In this moment of crisis, plague doctors throughout Europe made different choices, creating the diverse historical narratives that would later be simplified into the iconic but incomplete image of the beaked physician. Some continued their appointed rounds until the plague claimed them, maintaining professional function even as emotional breakdown made their work increasingly mechanistic. Others abandoned their positions despite legal prohibitions, choosing flight over continued witnessing of unstoppable tragedy. Still others transformed their practice, discarding ineffective traditional treatments in favor of comfort measures that acknowledged medicine's limitations while still offering human care. Your own decision in this moment will be shaped by individual temperament, personal circumstances, and the specific experiences that led to this breaking point. But whatever choice emerges, it will reflect the fundamental reality of the plague doctor's existence, not the mysterious, powerful figure of later artistic imagination, but an ordinary person confronting extraordinary circumstances with inadequate tools, insufficient knowledge, and the unbearable weight of witnessing human suffering on an unprecedented scale. As the sun sets over Venice, casting long shadows that seem to embody the darkness spreading across Europe, you stand at this crossroads of professional identity and human response, your iconic beaked silhouette embodying both medicine's ambitious reach and its humbling limitations in the face of nature's most devastating biological weapons. Whether you continue your appointed rounds until disease claims you, abandon your post despite the legal consequences, or transform your practice to acknowledge medicine's limitations while still offering comfort, your experience as a plague doctor leaves a complex legacy that extends far beyond the iconic image that will fascinate later centuries. The immediate impact is personal, the physical and psychological trauma of prolonged exposure to mass death, the crisis of professional identity when treatments prove largely ineffective, and the fundamental questions about meaning and purpose that arise when human knowledge confronts its limitations. Few plague doctors emerged from the Black Death psychologically intact, with historical records suggesting high rates of what modern medicine would classify as post-traumatic stress, substance abuse as self-medication, and crises of faith or professional confidence. For those who survived both the disease and the psychological impact of their work, the experience often transformed their subsequent medical practice. Many abandoned the humorism and astrological foundations of medieval medicine, having observed firsthand their failure to explain or address the plague. Some turned toward more empirical approaches based on direct observation rather than ancient authorities, laying early groundwork for the scientific revolution that would eventually transform medicine. Others left medical practice entirely, their faith in the profession's efficacy permanently damaged by its failure against the plague. The wider medical establishment similarly gradually evolved in response to the Black Death, though more slowly than individual practitioners. The plague's devastation highlighted weaknesses in existing medical theory, creating openings for alternative approaches and gradually shifting the profession toward greater empiricism. Public health measures emerged more systematically, with cities implementing quarantines, sanitation improvements, and epidemic response protocols based on hard lessons learned during the plague years. The iconic plague doctor costume itself underwent evolution, becoming more standardized and elaborate in subsequent centuries. The simple waxed leather and canvas protective gear of the initial outbreak gradually transformed into the more theatrical full-length leather coat, specialized mask, and distinctive hat, familiar from later illustrations. This evolution reflected both practical improvements in protective design and the costume's increasing symbolic function as a visual representation of medicine confronting epidemic disease. Perhaps most significantly, the plague doctor became a powerful cultural symbol with meanings that shifted across time and context. To contemporaries during the Black Death, plague doctors represented both hope of treatment and harbingers of death, their distinctive silhouette inspiring complex emotional responses ranging from desperate relief to terror. As the immediate crisis receded, this ambivalence transformed into literary and artistic representation, with plague doctors appearing in everything from serious medical treatises to carnivalesque imagery mocking death. By the 17th century, when later plague outbreaks again necessitated specialized physicians, the plague doctor had become a fully formed archetype, part medical practitioner, part symbolic figure representing humanity's response to epidemics. This dual identity appears clearly in images from this period, where the costume's practical protective elements are exaggerated for visual impact, creating the distinctive appearance now instantly recognizable in popular culture. The plague doctor's enduring legacy extends beyond medical history into broader cultural understanding of how societies respond to catastrophic disease. The psychological function performed by these physicians, maintaining the illusion of control and intervention when confronting largely uncontrollable natural forces, reveals patterns that reappear in responses to subsequent epidemics throughout history. From cholera to influenza to modern pandemics, the tension between actual medical efficacy and the psychological need for active response continues to shape both professional practice and public health policy. For modern medical practitioners, the plague doctor represents both a cautionary tale and an inspiration. The caution lies in recognizing the limitations of current knowledge, the danger of overpromising results, and the psychological toll of confronting conditions that resist treatment. The inspiration comes from the courage shown by ordinary individuals who, despite inadequate training and protection, continued attempting to alleviate suffering even when cure remained elusive. The plague doctor's experience also highlights enduring questions about medicine's purpose beyond simple cure. When disease proves untreatable, does medical practice still serve valuable functions through comfort, presence, and bearing witness to suffering? The plague doctor's role inevitably expanded beyond strict medical intervention into psychological support, spiritual counsel, and the maintenance of social continuity amid biological chaos, functions that remain essential in modern palliative and epidemic medicine. Perhaps most relevantly for contemporary audiences, the plague doctor embodies the ethical dilemmas facing medical practitioners during public health emergencies. The tension between personal safety and professional duty, the allocation of limited resources during overwhelming demand, and the psychological burden of maintaining function amid mass casualty events, all these modern concerns find historical precedent in the plague doctor's experience. By understanding these historical parallels, contemporary medical ethics can incorporate lessons from previous catastrophes rather than reinventing responses to recurring challenges. The iconic image of the plague plague doctor has experienced a remarkable resurgence in popular culture, appearing in everything from carnival costumes to video game characters to pandemic-related memes. This renewed fascination reflects both aesthetic attraction to the distinctive silhouette and deeper resonance with contemporary anxieties about epidemic disease, medical limitations, and mortality itself. The Plague Doctor has become a shorthand visual reference for humanity confronting unstoppable natural forces, a symbol simultaneously frightening and reassuring in its suggestion that even our worst biological nightmares have precedent. For historians of medicine, the Plague Doctor represents a crucial case study in how medical practice evolves in response to unprecedented challenges. The inadequacy of existing theory when confronting the Black Death created pressure for new approaches, eventually contributing to the scientific revolution that transformed medicine from philosophical speculation to empirical science. This pattern of crisis-driving innovation continues throughout medical history, with epidemic disease frequently forcing reconsideration of established practice and accelerating adoption of novel approaches. Perhaps most fundamentally, the Plague Doctor's experience illuminates the persistent human need to take action in the face of catastrophe, even when that action's effectiveness may be limited. The elaborate protective costume, the complex treatments, the detailed record-keeping, all represented attempts to impose order and agency on a situation that fundamentally resisted human control. This psychological imperative to act rather than merely witness suffering remains a driving force in both medical practice and broader social responses to disaster. As we view the Plague Doctor across the centuries, what emerges is not the mysterious, almost supernatural figure of popular imagination, but something simultaneously more ordinary and more profound. A human being confronting extraordinary circumstances with inadequate tools, insufficient knowledge, and the unbearable weight of witnessing suffering on an unprecedented scale. The true heroism of the Plague Doctor lies not in miraculous cures or mysterious powers, but in the simple, terrible courage required to continue functioning amid catastrophe, a quality that resonates across the centuries whenever medicine confronts its limitations. In this light, perhaps the most accurate memorial to the Plague Doctor is not the dramatic artistic renderings or the carnival costumes, but the quiet recognition that throughout human history, ordinary people have demonstrated extraordinary courage when confronting overwhelming biological disaster. From the medieval plague doctor in leather and canvas to the modern physician in N95 mask and face shield, this fundamental willingness to stand between society and its biological threats represents one of humanity's most persistent and admirable characteristics. As you remove your plague doctor costume for the final time, whether through death, desertion, or the plague's eventual recession, your individual experience becomes part of this larger historical narrative. The physical and psychological toll you've endured, the ethical dilemmas you've navigated, and the fundamental questions about medicine's purpose that have emerged from your work all contribute to the complex legacy that will eventually be simplified into the iconic beaked silhouette recognized worldwide. But behind that simplified image lies the reality you've lived, the daily confrontation with suffering beyond your capacity to alleviate, the constant risk of personal infection despite elaborate protective measures, and the gradual realization that medical knowledge of your era offers primarily the illusion of control rather than effective intervention against the Black Death's devastation. This gap between medical aspiration and practical reality during epidemic crisis represents perhaps the plague doctor's most important legacy. By illuminating the limitations of human knowledge when confronting novel disease, the plague doctor's experience creates space for both humility about current understanding and determination to develop more effective responses to future biological threats. This dual recognition that medical knowledge has boundaries while still possessing value even within those limitations informs approaches to catastrophic disease throughout subsequent history. As we conclude this journey through the grim realities of medieval plague doctoring, perhaps you're feeling grateful to have experienced this profession only through historical exploration rather than direct direct participation. The physical hardships, psychological trauma, and professional futility facing these early epidemic responders created one of history's most challenging occupational experiences, a role most modern individuals would neither survive nor psychologically tolerate, despite our retrospective fascination with its iconic imagery. Yet fragments of the plague doctor experience persist in contemporary medical practice, particularly during modern pandemics when healthcare workers again don protective gear, confront overwhelming mortality, and struggle with the limitations of medical intervention against novel pathogens. The specific technology changes dramatically. N95 masks replacing beaked designs, antibiotics offering cure rather than merely comfort. But certain fundamental human experiences of providing care during the mass mortality events show remarkable continuity across centuries. This historical continuity offers a perspective that might help modern healthcare workers contextualize their own experiences within longer patterns of human response to biological disaster. The psychological impacts so commonly reported during COVID-19 surges, emotional numbness, intrusive memories of dying patients, disillusionment with medical effectiveness, and profound exhaustion beyond mere physical fatigue, all appear in historical accounts of plague doctors, suggesting these responses represent fundamental human reactions to witnessing suffering beyond capacity to alleviate rather than individual failing or weakness. Similarly, the difficult ethical challenges facing modern clinicians during pandemic resource limitations, decisions about care allocation, balancing personal safety against patient needs, maintaining function amid overwhelming tragedy, all find precedent in the plague doctor's daily reality. This historical perspective doesn't reduce the difficulty of these challenges, but potentially provides reassurance that they represent inherent tensions in epidemic healthcare, rather than unique modern failures or unprecedented ethical dilemmas. For the general public, understanding the plague doctor's experience offers valuable insights about reasonable expectations during epidemic events. The historical record demonstrates that even the most dedicated medical practitioners faced overwhelming limitations against novel pathogens, that public health measures always involved difficult trade-offs between competing societal needs, and that human psychological resilience showed consistent patterns of initial compliance, followed by increasing resistance as epidemics stretched from acute emergency to chronic challenge. These patterns help contextualize modern experiences within longer historical perspectives on how societies manage biological disasters. Perhaps most valuably, the plague doctor's story illuminates the consistent human determination to maintain function and provide care even amid catastrophic circumstances that defy complete solution. From medieval physicians continuing rounds despite knowing their treatments offered minimal effectiveness to modern healthcare workers returning to COVID units despite personal risk and psychological toll, this fundamental willingness to stand between society and its biological threats represents one of humanity's most persistent and admirable characteristics across centuries of epidemic challenge. As you drift toward sleep, perhaps consider that while we've emphasized the hardships and limitations facing medieval plague doctors throughout this exploration, their legacy also includes this remarkable testament to human resilience, the capacity to continue functioning, providing care, and maintaining social continuity even when confronting seemingly insurmountable biological disaster. This enduring determination to act in the face of overwhelming challenge, visible from medieval plague wards to modern COVID units, offers reassurance that whatever biological threats humanity confronts in future centuries will be met with similar courage, adaptation, and persistence despite inevitable limitation and loss. Sleep well, knowing that while the plague doctor's beaked silhouette has become a cultural shorthand for humanity's vulnerability to disease, it simultaneously represents our species' remarkable capacity to maintain both practical function and and fundamental compassion, even amid our darkest epidemiological hours. A dual legacy that continues through every white coat and N95 mask confronting modern biological threats with the same essential courage, though vastly improved tools. The plague doctor's true inheritance lies not in the theatrical costume that fascinates contemporary imagination, but in this enduring human determination to provide care despite limitation, uncertainty, and risk. Perhaps our most valuable collective resource when confronting the biological vulnerabilities that remain constant companions throughout human history. Good night, and perhaps appreciate the luxury of resting without a beaked mask, without leather gloves glued to your skin with sweat, without the weight of hundreds of inevitable deaths awaiting your attention tomorrow morning. The plague doctor would certainly envy your peaceful sleep, uninterrupted by church bells announcing new deaths or desperate knocking seeking impossible cures. In understanding their grueling reality, we gain not just historical knowledge, but deeper appreciation for both medical progress achieved and the remarkable human resilience that remains our most essential resource when facing biological disaster across the centuries.